Claire Marie Brisson, thank you so much for joining me today. You're a preceptor in French at Harvard University. You're also the host of the Francophone podcast, which has a new season coming soon. You're also the author of a forthcoming book called Michiganaise, and you appear on Radio Canada as a special correspondent. So, Claire Marie, thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
So I wanted to start by chatting a little bit about your background, your linguistic background, which I know is very interesting and unique. And I was wondering if you could sort of tell me a little bit about the languages that you spoke growing up and how those languages and that sort of polyglot background carried you through your education experience.
Well, I'd be very happy to bring everyone with me on a journey back to where I grew up. I really grew up at the border between Canada and the United States in Dearborn, Michigan. And Dearborn, Michigan is a truly incredible place because it is one of the few places in North America, to my knowledge, where you can hear the Arabic language spoken in multiple variants, Lebanese, Yemeni, and this is all within one community. Every single day when I grew up as a child, I would see signs written in English, in Arabic, and in Spanish. And at home, I was speaking French, I was speaking English, and I also was learning a little bit of German because there is a familial connection there with German in my family. And so this really set me up for a multilingual experience. I mean, this is true of many communities, of many people who grew up in the United States, in Canada, abroad, where there are multiple languages sort of swirling around a person's experience. And that lived experience where I was there at the border with Canada, the United States, where I knew that my family lived in Canada, that I was growing up in the United States, and that this rich community, this rich multilingual community existed around me was something that inspired me my whole life. And so when I was over at my friends' houses, their parents often did not speak to them in English. They spoke to them in Arabic, they spoke to them in Spanish, Romanian, Tamil. And in turn, I started asking questions. I said, wait a minute, how do you say this? How do you say this? And sometimes I was a little confused. I remember in kindergarten, for example, it was a very multilingual environment. There were a lot of different speakers all at once in the same classroom. And sometimes I got frustrated when I asked for something in French, like a livre, a book, and someone else didn't understand me. So there were, of course, little speed bumps, little things to overcome. But it really set me up for being interested in languages, being interested in those intersections, really understanding what it means to have grown up at the border between Canada and the United States, a liquid border, the Detroit River that separates Windsor and Detroit. So all of these things really were in the background.
So it sounds like it was a kind of confluence situation of many different streams, if you will. And so when you were at home, how did you, to what degree did you speak French? To what degree did you speak English? How did you negotiate which language you would speak at which time and with whom?
Well, it was interesting because my grandfather lived very close by. So when I was a child, my parents often put me in his care. And that was almost 100% in French when I was with my grandfather. When I was at home, it really depended on the context, it depended on the feeling and the mood. I really do think that. Having a parent tell you to do something in French comes across differently than to do it in English or to do it in German. And it really depended. I mean, in the kitchen, it would be in French, it would be in English, it would be in German, depending on recipes, depending on where our minds were at the time as well. And it was interesting because it was really my dad who had the idea that he wanted every single thing to be multilingual. My mom had the idea that she at one point wanted to work for the UN. She had these dreams about, language herself, and she had studied Spanish in her own studies. And my father was very interested in the fact that she was so interested in languages. I was so interested in languages. And he was the one who said, okay, everybody, I see we're all on the same page here. We should really investigate this. And then it really grew into kind of a family tradition for us at home to talk about languages, to think about things internationally. And my mom always encouraged me to just keep going, keep doing, and pursue the dream that she ultimately didn't do. And when I was about 10 years old or so, I was watching my mom finishing up her own college education, which was actually a wedding anniversary kind of gift or encouragement from my dad to her to finish her education. So I saw her going through the motions, finishing up her degree and saying, "Hey, you can do this too. You should definitely do this and lift yourself in a way that others can also join you with it."
So it seems like very early on you had a sense that language, linguistic knowledge was a kind of empowerment or a kind of power, a kind of way of accessing things. But I was kind of curious, before perhaps you came to that realization, maybe when you were a little younger, how did you think of your own identity, your own linguistic identity? Were you saying to yourself, wait, I've got French, I've got these other languages, I have English, which is my sort of inner language? Or did you not think about it in that way?
Um, some of the most fascinating things for me are the dreams I had as a child, because the dreams are kind of fragmented. They were in English, they were in French, they had words in German. They didn't really have the barriers and boundaries that we set on languages and communities and cultures in the daily life in the conscious world. And that meant a lot to me as I grew up, and I reflected on what it meant to be multilingual, what it meant to have these languages, because ultimately you start to realize, you start to almost self-police when you're using certain words, when you're thinking certain ideas, how you're thinking about ideas, how you articulate the ideas. And it's really, I can't say when I started to have this consciousness of, okay, this is my language, this is the one language that belongs to me, because I felt at the intersection. I really do feel like the Canadian culture that all of my family has had for generations, that the American culture that I grew up around, that the cultures that surrounded me in the Metro Detroit area all influenced my sense of self, my sense of place. And I didn't really want to claim one or the other above one or the other. And so I kind of created my own little melting pot, a mixed up experience between languages, intersections of experiences. And that was really beautiful to me. And I think it's also the experience of many of my friends, many of my colleagues who grew up in the same area, realizing that, they had family who came from Lebanon. They spoke Arabic at home. Maybe they didn't read Arabic fluently, but they were able to grow up with that experience and eventually pursued different things with that language as well as English. So I felt at home in all of my languages, and that's kind of what I try to bring to my classroom as well. Is it's often an isolating kind of nervous experience learning a new language, saying, will my accent be good enough? Will I be accepted within the community? Who belongs in the community? And that sense of belonging is something I try to foster, even with a student who maybe has had 1, 2 years of French.
Yeah, no, I understand. Um, I think that's really interesting. I think that many people who have a multilingual background, maybe they assign a certain value to one language over another, and it's cool that it was really multiple intersections of languages, and one didn't necessarily prevail over the others. So, as you were thinking about language, learning as a kind of, as I've understood from what you've said, as a kind of motor for your educational goals and your educational experience. Can you talk about how that might have evolved over time? I know that you uh, did your undergraduate, you also did a master's and a PhD, and now you're a preceptor in French. So can you talk about how your own thinking about language evolved over the time that you were studying and getting more and more, deeper into and becoming deeper into language teaching and what language can do and how it relates to the broader world?
Sure. My undergraduate experience was the experience that's shared by many students, particularly in the United States and Canada. It is the commuter experience. For the most part, I was at the University of Michigan Dearborn, which is an offshoot, a satellite of the University of Michigan Ann Arbor. It was created initially as an engineering campus, since it's so close, its proximity to the Ford Motor Company. And that area, Dearborn, again, is, as I've mentioned, a very multicultural area, an area where the world is at your doorstep. And I recognized that language had been important in my life and continued to be important. And they had a thriving French language program at the University of Michigan Dearborn. And so I decided to follow the classes there, take some classes, the upper level classes. And I really made a connection with many of the professors there. I learned a lot. The environments were also interesting because many of the students, this was their third or fourth language that they were learning. And we were really in the shadow of Ford Motor Company. We were close to Canada. We had this incredible mosaic of cultures that existed around us. It just made sense for me to do this degree, to do a degree in French. However, the interesting thing is when I started talking to people about what I wanted to do, even some of the academic counselors or future job counselors, they said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! You're getting a degree in French?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, you know, you want to be sure to make smart choices so that you have a career in the future." And there was nothing that really dissuaded me from that. I said, "No, this is what I'm going to do, and I know I can do things with it." And they said, "Well, what things?" And I started thinking about education. I have a degree in secondary education. I thought I was going to teach high school at first. And I started subbing once I had 90 credit hours in my former high school. I worked in area high schools, and I realized that I wanted to pursue even more education after that. I wanted to do something where I could maybe be in a college classroom and really compare my experience. And so, as I was finishing up with my last year at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, my advisor came up to me and said, "You do realize that you could have your graduate studies funded." This was something that was never really in my mind. You know, this was something that my father, for example, was the first to go to college. The rest of my family were more or less electricians, had worked in some measure with the auto industry, had worked as janitors. So this was my dad was really kind of the gateway into education. My mom, I saw her go to school, go to college when I was young. And for me, I this academic world just I didn't know anything about it. I thought that was totally closed off to me financially. But she said, you know, you can pursue a master's, it will have funding. You could pursue a PhD, it will have funding. And suddenly this light bulb goes on in my brain, and I say, wait, what? This is possible? And so I went to Wayne State University in Detroit afterwards, which was a phenomenal experience because the university almost looks over the border. It is close enough. The building where I was in looked over at the Detroit River, and I recognized that place and that space where I was so crucial to language learning, language teaching as well. And it was really at that point where, you know, I'm pursuing a master's degree. I'm in the classroom with students from Canada, from the United States, from the city of Detroit, from communities around the area, just talking about French, learning French, and telling me why they wanted to learn French.
And then can you talk a bit about your transition to Harvard and also the classes that you teach there? I know you and I had a discussion earlier this week, and you were mentioning a bit about the a class that you teach, and I was very fascinated by it. So yeah, could you just talk a little bit about that chapter of your experience?
Absolutely. Um, I didn't want to stay in Michigan forever. I wanted to share my experiences elsewhere. And so I pursued my PhD at the University of Virginia. And as I pursued my PhD at the University of Virginia, I looked at North American French speaking communities. I looked at how we can really integrate the idea of the here and now and remove the idea of foreign from foreign languages. And then also moved me towards thinking about environment and what we can do, how to design our environments, how to think about the environment, and what it means to have such an impact on our environment. Again, I'm from a state where we had the Flint water crisis. The largest system of freshwater lakes are the Great Lakes. And water had always been in the back of my mind. I'd always thought about water. I'd always thought about the equality of access to fresh water and to having a clean environment, particularly coming from the Rust Belt. And so when I was at the University of Virginia, I was separated from this idea, and I thought, where can I bring this? How can I bring this to a classroom? And then COVID hits, the world shuts, and I'm in my small apartment in Charlottesville, Virginia, thinking about where am I going to bring this? Who am I going to bring this to? And I was on the job market. Anyone who's in academia knows what the job market is like, and doubly so in COVID. And I started looking around, and I found the preceptor position in French at Harvard. And I thought that, first of all, why not? And second of all, let me tell them what I'd like to do. And one of the things I really wanted to do was to bring that idea, the idea about people, about culture, about communities, about identity, environments, and just make it into a class for advanced French speakers, while at the same time working with intermediate and advanced French speakers about Francophone medias, such as podcasting, and Francophone film. And so once I was accepted, I got the job and I was brought to Harvard. I launched my Discovering French in North America class. And a lot of people, when I say, oh, Discovering French in North America, their first gut feeling is, oh, this is a class entirely about Quebec, or this is a class entirely about Quebec, maybe a little Louisiana. And actually, I make the students start the semester in a river, with the Mississippi River. We look at literature that's related to the river. We look at the environmental impacts of the river. We read poetry in French about the river. And then we use the river as the way that we launch the rest of the semester. We journey through waterways through North America, looking at the French language in North America, looking at the impacts, looking at why the French language is here in North America, the colonial influence of French, and also the influence of indigenous peoples in North America. And so we look at the literatures of these communities, such as we look at Kukum, which is a book by Michel Jean, written in French from the Innu perspective. And we also look at minority French language literatures, such as an Acadian author whose name is Brad Cormier. And we read his book, which is also based off of rivers. It's called Rivière-Rance in the class. And this bridges us to the larger community, and ultimately we make it into a community project.
Yeah, I would have many questions about this class. It's a very fascinating concept. And, you know, when you introduce this concept of the class to students, how do they react? Do they sort of get it instantly? Or are they like, I've never heard of a French class sort of being centered on North America, being, centered around rivers and waterways. So, how do students, I guess, react to that? And then how do they like get it once they've sort of been brought into it?
Well, it's funny because in some of the student evaluations, they say, well, I really wasn't too interested in this class because it's North America and I'm here in North America. Why would I take a class about French in North America? I mean, it just doesn't seem interesting. But then there's the big comma, but, and then they realize why looking at a language in a place that's a little bit closer, has proximity, is important, number one. And number two, that huge impact of connecting and bridging environmental studies, climate to the class. For many students is incredibly important and changes entirely their perspective about learning a language like French and about what they can do with a language like French. So, as an example, we bring in Hydro-Québec, which has a new American offshoot here, working to bring hydroelectric energy to the United States. And I bring in the actors who really are working to create those connections here in the United States, talking about sustainability, talking about what it means that we have a connection with Quebec in this way. And at the same time, we look at it critically because we've already analyzed some Indigenous texts. We've looked at texts that talk about the environment. We look at texts that talk about cultures. And then we say, okay, well, what is the history of Hydro-Québec? Who is Hydro-Québec? What are they doing? And can we negotiate this in French? Ultimately, the students are negotiating in the target language. And for them, this is something that is not just a reading. It's not just, oh, well, this happened historically. They have the actors in the classroom with them. And I had the opportunity last October to actually go up to the James Bay and see the hydroelectric station, ask questions for the students, bring back evidence, such as videos, for the students to look at and use as in-class materials, really first-person materials, because they're looking at how I saw the terrain. And then they make conclusions, they draw conclusions, they worked on research projects of their choice that extended to the community. And many of the students said in evaluations, and also to me personally, that this completely changed their perspective about language learning because they felt like they had a real and true fingerprint on what was happening now.
Can you talk a little bit about that, how that conversation went between the students and the representatives of Hydro-Québec, which is a power company, a utility company, I guess? Yeah, how'd that whole thing play out? Were they nervous? Were they feeling strong and ready to ask them tough questions? How did that all play out?
Well, I think that the students were very strong. They had linguistic partners throughout the semester. We did an exchange with students at the University Laval online on a platform known as Tandem. And so students had practicing, they had partners, conversation partners that they would talk about larger topics with. They also had a couple of other visitors during the semester. And so once Hydro-Québec came to the classroom, they realized, oh, this has, a lot of importance, not only for the semester, but also for what Hydro-Québec will bring out of the classroom. So I saw a couple of students were a little bit nervous at the beginning of class, obviously.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think that the materials that they read really did prepare them well. And there were, at first the students were kind of, snowballing questions like, oh, well, what about this and this and this? And then suddenly it was just, and this is what I think critically, and what can you do about this more? Oh, I see that you want to extend your reach to Massachusetts. Tell me about that. And I think that not only for them was it exciting, but also for the representatives from Hydro-Quebec. They came into the classroom and they said, first of all, the French, that they were not expecting that level of French, and second of all, the questions and the thoughtfulness of questions resonated with them. And ultimately, they said that they would love to continue this partnership in other classes and also just on campus, to have more questions, to really expose what they're trying to do, some of the challenges that they had in the past, some of the issues historically in the past, and also what they're trying to do for the climate and for the future. So that future thinking was really something that I think students gained a lot from that exchange with Hydro-Quebec.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, I was wondering if I could ask you a little bit to reflect more generally relating back to this project and to this class, which is, I think when many people think of language classes, either they think of, oh, you're going and drilling grammar forms, or maybe you're going and learning how to order a café au lait in France. Um, these kind of, I would say, less inspiring ways of learning a language. But what you're describing is really, so engaging for students and so relevant to young people who are living in a world that is affected drastically by climate change, by environmental issues. And these environmental issues are, to some extent, shaped by individuals, and so I think language can be an important component of that. So can you talk more generally in your view about this kind of role that language study can have?
Absolutely. So, thank you for that. I felt like that was kind of a question, kind of like a little boost for the class. It's always interesting to think about the utility of languages. I think that being able to order a café au lait in the context of French is totally fine. Absolutely something that you need, an essential skill that you'll need when you're visiting a French-speaking country. But I think a lot of students, again, when they think and they add in this idea of otherness or foreignness to languages, then it can be reduced to just travel. And when we think about the impact of travel, we think about the impact of climate change, and we think about why are we traveling? What is the purpose of traveling? What is the purpose of seeing a culture as so different that you're only going to be learning those transactional exchanges to have with somebody, and then ultimately transition over to English, which is often what happens in those exchanges. Um, it's really taking the idea and reestablishing why we're learning languages. I read something by Barry Lopez. It was called Landscape and Narrative, and it talks about the external landscape, so communities, and then the internal landscape, and that's really the projection of the self within the community. And what's interesting about that perspective, when you think about yourself as within the community, within the environment, even if you don't belong to a culture, you are still a part of the environment if you are visiting a place. And so it's understanding that when you're dialoguing, when you're using communication within a place, your communication has utility, but your communication can have so much more impact and can be related to current issues of the day. And that's why I think really establishing the connection and that bridge between, okay, this is what's happening in the world. These are what the things that students really care about. This is what governments really care about. It almost makes a diplomatic conversation open up between the learner in the target language and the crucial pressing issues of the day. And you know, you can never, if somebody is really not interested in a certain topic, you can never convince someone to be interested in a topic, but you sure can have a debate or a discussion in that topic. So that's why we really should move towards this content rich, content based, contemporary use of language, especially for students as they're beginning a language, all the way to intermediate and advanced speakers and learners. Um, as an example, if a student is learning about climate and is learning about what is going on, say, for example, in Guadeloupe, at the beginning, when they're just an introductory student, a beginner student, they'll have this toolbox that they can bring with them when they're a B1 student, when they're a C1 student, as their language evolves. And they'll say, wait, I remember this just from the basis of my French learning experience. I know how to order a café au lait, but at the same time, I can dialogue with people in their communities and ask them what's really important and establish lasting relationships with members of the communities so that you can better understand perspectives, particularly when we think about future thinking. What does it mean to dialogue with a community member? Is it just talking about your hobbies and what you like to eat at a restaurant? Maybe, but it could also go deeper than that, and it can really show the connections that we have between cultures and the challenges that we might face in the future.
And I totally agree with that. And I think that if you try to do that all in English without any knowledge of other languages, you're just not going to get very far beneath the surface. It'll always be just a very superficial type of interaction. Um,
Absolutely.
so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. So we were speaking at the beginning, I was talking about how you have a podcast and you're going to be publishing a book soon. So, you know, I'm very interested in the topics of both of these. Could you talk a little bit about the podcast and about the book?
Sure. So the North American Francophone podcast was the podcast I launched in November of 2019. I was sitting on actually the couch that's just behind me, and I was writing my dissertation. And I stopped and I looked at the screen and I said, wait a minute. I know that my committee is going to be reading this. I know that eventually this will transform itself into a book or into articles. But who am I dialoguing with right now? Who is here with me? It's just me, the page, a couple of discussions with my committee members, the articles I'm finding, and I didn't want to just keep that conversation on the page. So I really wanted to open up discussions about what I was researching, about what I was doing, and I launched the podcast. And at this point, I have 30 plus episodes where some of them are just me presenting information in English to the community, and others are dialogues between myself and authors, community members, activists, etc., who really truly care about the French language for different reasons. And some of these conversations, many of these conversations, are the first time that these people have had the information that they wanted to share shared in English. And I wanted it to be shared in English because when we talk about the Francophone community, you know, Francophones or French speakers know about all of the diversity of the Francophone community. But in the English language, when you say French, people think of France. And it's just not the case that France is the center of the French language. There are 11 million French speakers in the largest capital of French speaking places. It's in Kinshasa, and that's not Paris. So you know, it's dialoguing about what the Francophonie is, where the Francophonie is, who are French speakers, why are they French speakers, and what are we doing with French now and for the future. And so the mission of the Francophonie was initially launched in Africa by African French speakers to say, here we are. And the mission of my podcast was launched in English because I was saying, okay, Francophone speakers are in many places in the world, but who are they? And how can we talk to the Academy in English about these experiences? And so what I'm trying to do with that podcast moving forward is I've had a sort of a discussion with many North American Francophones, with Francophones across Canada and the United States, And now what I'm really trying to shift and do is look at communities and their environments, look at communities and those same questions that we were talking about today. What is really important for communities? What are communities doing? And how does language play a role within their communities? Is French strong? Is the revitalization of French strong as it is in Louisiana? Is French a language that was a colonial language? Why are people using the French language in certain environments? It's interesting to think that the Francophonie, the organization of the Francophonie, started in Africa. Why did it start in Africa? What does it mean to be a French speaker in places like France that are traditionally known as French speaking, are known as kind of the launch pad for the French language? What does it mean to speak French there? And ultimately, why are we learning the French language? What is the utility of the French language? What are other things that we can really focus on within those community exchanges across borders, across countries, across continents? What can we really achieve by learning the French language? And I hope to bring diplomats, I hope to bring authors, I hope to bring students, I hope to bring community members just to discuss with me, what does French mean to them and what does it mean in their community?
I will be sure to include a link to the podcast so that anybody listening to this podcast, which I think is kind of similar in a way, a language podcast that tries to explore the connections between language learning and different areas of achievement, endeavor, and concern. So I'll put a link in the description. And then can I ask you a little bit about the book that you'll be that is forthcoming?
Absolutely. So I'm currently working on a book called Michiganaise. If it sounds like mayonnaise, it's because it's kind of the same etymological root. When something is "-aise", it's in the style of, and I always say that I'm a Michiganaise. I'm in the style of Michigan. I'm a French speaker from Michigan, and oftentimes when you say you're a French speaker from Michigan, people immediately point to sort of the colonial period when Cadillac founded Detroit. When there were forts, and when the Midwest had a lot of trading, like fur trading, as an example. And so when I say, yes, I grew up in Michigan and I spoke French, and it's a person who's a contemporary who's living in 2024, people look at me like, wait, this is breaking sort of this historical time frame for me. Can you tell me more? And so I want to bring the contemporary discussion about language and place into my book. I'm looking at the historic connections of the French language to places like Detroit, and I'm focusing mainly on Metro Detroit because that's what I know the best, and that's where a lot of my research stems from. I've gone into the archives. I've looked at newspapers that were published in French in the area in the early 20th century, and I'm bringing that all together, kind of wrapping together history, memoir, and language learning, and saying, and this is what it means to be a French speaker in a place that's not considered a French speaking place. This is what it means to learn a language and to really integrate with other communities in places that are not understood to be that language speaking area. We often think the United States is an English speaking place, but we have no official language in this country. So it's really pushing the barriers of language, and it's asking people to reflect on, what does it mean to be from a place, to have that connection to place, and to have a connection to language or to languages, and to really be a part of that fabric, the community fabric in these areas. So I'm really excited to put the finishing touches on it and to share it with everyone because it's hopefully going to bring out some great conversations.
That sounds fascinating. I myself did not know about the rich linguistic history of Michigan and the presence of French there to the degree that it exists. So I'm excited for that book too. Um, well, Claire Marie Brisson, thank you so much for joining me today and for this rich conversation. I really appreciated it.
It was a pleasure, Chris. I hope you have a great rest of your day.